Hello everybody, this is Naz, and men lie, women lie, but stats don't lie. Welcome to our Road to TI7 special. I want to talk a little bit about the TI7 direct invite scenario as it stands today, what we know and what we don't know, as we have 4 more LAN events in the next 3 weeks that will determine our direct invites to the next international. So the question on everybody's mind today is how many direct invites we see. As we go back over the last 4 editions of the International, there have been 4 different numbers of direct invites, different every year. It's varied from only 6 last year to 13 if you go all the way back to TI3 out of a 16-team field. When you look at the majors have been all 8 direct invites and 8 qualifiers, with the exception of the Manila Major last year, where we saw a 12-4 split, 12 teams directly invited. The invite scenarios for TI are substantially more complicated than those when you talk about the majors themselves, due to the presence of the wild card plans. The wild card is not something that I expect will go away. It's extremely popular with players. TI is obviously, it's the event of the year for fans. It's also the event of the year in terms of players doing networking, not just play at this TI, but everybody knows the big roster shuffle is coming afterwards. Everybody knows that you want to be there in terms of being in on when teams are forming. So a lot of players, it's very popular that Valve is bringing in more teams, even if some of them are not playing in the main event and losing the wild cards. Rip me. All right. So I do think that that's going to continue. With that in mind, all right, let's talk about some of the example scenarios. Last year with TI6, you had 6 direct invites. You had 2 qualifiers each from 4 regions, and then 4 more wild card teams playing for the final 2 spots to round out the 16-team field. This year, when you talk about TI7, things are more complicated than ever because you have 6 different regions that we're going to hold qualifiers in. Now, for Kiev, just to give you an example of how things worked with these 6 regions. For Kiev, there were 8 direct invites, 2 qualifier teams from China and Southeast Asia, and then 1 team each from EU, CIS, NA, and South America. I think the most logical thing, if you look at how the format will go for TI7, would be to take those 2 extra spots away from China and SEA. So 1 team from each of the 6 regions plays directly into the field based on the qualifiers, and then 2 spots remain for the wildcard teams, however many there are of them, to fight over. So the 2 example invite scenarios that I give you, I think this will sort of serve to round out what could happen. With 6 invites, if they choose to go with the same number for TI7 as for TI6, I think you'd have 6 regional qualifiers, 1 from each region, play directly into the field, and then you'd have, I think, holding a tournament for 6 teams is a little bit awkward, so I think the most likely thing is they'd actually have 8 wildcard teams using the same regional breakdown that was used for Kiev, and then 4 remaining spots. So they'd ostensibly they'd have those 8 teams, and they could just do twice what they did last year. They could split them up into 2 groups of 4 and play GSL for 4 spots within each of those 2 groups. That's one reasonable solution I could see. For 7 to 9 invites, what starts happening is I still think you have 1 per region, and what starts happening is those total number of wild card spots start getting winnowed down. I do think it is actually possible, if they choose to have 3 spots, that they may have up to 12 wild card teams just due to format considerations. I still think the most likely number is going to be 8. All right, it could very well be, for example, that if they choose to go with, this is the scenario that I'm leaning toward right now, if they choose to go with 8 directly invited teams, that you'd have then 6 directly qualifying regional winners, and then 2 wildcard teams coming from 8 in the field. All right, so there are 4 teams as of today that I consider to be absolute locks. Really, it's 5, but let's start with these 4. Starting with the Frankfurt Major, 23 out of 24 teams who finished top 4 at the previous Valve event have been direct invites. So the only exception was last year Fnatic. After they finished top 4 at TI6. 3 players left their roster, and they were not directly invited to the Boston Major. But other than that, barring roster changes, it's been 100%. Of the Kiev Major top 4, furthermore, all but VP, every one of these teams but VP has a land win on 7-0X. So I think these 4 are absolutely in, no discussion needed. A couple of myths that I wanted to talk about in terms of what a lot of people say should define Valve invites. And again, I want to make clear in these videos, I generally don't talk about what I think should happen. I'm not arguing rights or right and wrong. I'm talking about what I think Valve is going to do. There are also some things on this slide that I do know for a fact based on private conversations that I am not going to share in terms of I'm not violating anybody's trust. But again, I know for a fact there is no set formula for major or TI invites. I would be willing to lay a substantial amount of money down that says as of today, even Valve doesn't know exactly how many teams are going to be invited to TI7. Valve is a company, their corporate decision-making is very much based on flexibility and outside the box thinking. This is going to be decided after they see all of the results from the upcoming lands. There is a role, there's some people talking about the invites not necessarily being independent. If they invite Team X, they feel like they have to invite Team Y. I do think that has played a role in the past, possibly with Adfinem and Wing/Team Random at Kiev. Almost certainly, if you go back to Manila, I think the 12 invites for Manila was pretty clearly a case of them wanting a third Chinese direct invite and feeling obligated to include a number of other teams as well. Again, you can talk about whether you agree or disagree, but I do think that that is the past precedent potential. So I know, again, for fact, Valve's subjective evaluation of teams, their strengths, the pedigree on their roster, and their play style in the current patch does play a role in which teams go. Valve does not want MUFCs in the field, okay? And they take very seriously how good do we think this team is right now. I don't want to minimize stats and ELO ranking do play a role. Knoxville used to tell me when he maintained his own site for ELO rankings of Pro Dota 2 teams that he would always see spikes in traffic around the time that qualifiers or invites were being decided on. And a lot of those IPs were coming from Bellevue. My own view is that stats and ELO rankings are used by Valve very extensively when they do groups and when they do bracket seedings, probably more so than for invites, but of course they're going to play a role in both. The LAN pedigree myth. This is something I obviously got into. I get into it on Twitter about this on a somewhat regular basis. I think people way overemphasize format and strength of field when they're talking about which lands matter. Which lands matter is largely a product of the teams involved and a lot of time is a product of circumstance, okay? I'm going to argue, for example, that Epicenter, which is the top line tournament of the season outside the majors, basically every team that you would want to be there competing is there. And I actually think Epicenter is probably not going to matter when you talk about TI invites. I think that another tournament, this Galaxy Battle Land, which was announced sort of last minute, we don't even know all the teams competing. I actually think that has a possibility to matter a lot more than Epicenter. It's not necessarily about the strength of the teams or the format of the tournament. It's about the timing and which teams stand to gain or lose the most from finishing high in the field. So we'll talk about that. But I don't think you can just look at tournaments and say, well, you know, that tournament was single elimination. That doesn't matter. That's just not how Valve has done things in the past. And if you look back, for example, to last year, Execration was invited to the Boston Major based entirely on MPGL, which was a smaller SEA regional LAN with a few Chinese teams. Na'Vi was one of only 6 invites to TI6 based largely on their performance at ESL1 Frankfurt, where they were runners-up. Number 1, that was a single elimination tournament for the semis and grand finals, exactly the same format as the Star Ladder event we just got done with. and they were blown out 3-0 in the grand finals against OG. And they were one of only 6 invites to TI6 based largely on that after they performed okay, but not necessarily great at the Manila Major. So if land pedigree matters at all, you might see it at the Zotac Cup event that we'll talk about in a moment. There is a possibility that with that event, you might see a team win that and not be invited. Even there, though, I think that's actually fairly unlikely. The last thing I'll talk about, there is very little evidence that you can quote unquote play your way out. I think the one exception that you can point to last year with Fnatic, they were top 6 at the Manila Major. They had a very rough showing right after Manila at the ESL1 Frankfurt event, and they were not invited to TI6. So, you know, you can argue Fnatic is sort of the double snub, all right? But MVP were invited to TI6 over Fnatic. And I think that performance at the ESL1 Frankfurt event immediately afterward did play a role in that decision. Again, that's really the only exception I can point to. And there were actually people that said that, for example, that the current Thunderbirds team at the time, Digital Chaos, that might not be invited to Kiev because their last couple of events before that weren't as solid. I just don't see in general that that's going to happen. All right, so 3 weeks to go. If history is any guide, direct invites are typically going to be announced about 2 to 3 days before open qualifiers begin. Last year, they were actually announced within 24 hours of the end of ESL1 Frankfurt. The last round of events, the Summit as well as Galaxy Battle, ends on the 18th. I actually think you're going to see TI7 direct invites almost for certain released on the 19th or 20th. If you look at what the field is likely to look at. So from Frankfurt to the Kiev Majors, including TI6, there have been 50 direct invites total out of those fields. 23 out of 50, as we discussed, were top 4 at the previous major. 9 more teams, if we're doing the accounting, were 5th or 6th at a previous double elimination major. Again, with the exception of Fnatic going into TI6 last year. So that leaves 18 out of 50 teams. And of those 18 left over, 17 had either won or finished second at a LAN since the previous major invites were announced. It's not the timing here. There's a little bit of a detail. It's not just since the previous major. You do have to look at events that fell in between the time that the last set of direct invites were announced to the major itself, because Valve does still give you credit, quote unquote, for those events. So for example, Alliance, if you look at the time between the Shanghai event being announced, the Shanghai invites being announced, and the Shanghai Major itself, they won a Star Ladder event that they didn't get credit for, even though they were invited to Shanghai, and that was part of the reason that they were invited again to the Manila Major. The only exception out of those 18 teams, LGD was invited to the Manila Major without that big win or runner-up appearance at a major LAN. And that was, again, the 12 invite scenario. And I think they just wanted an additional Chinese team in the field. In fact, if you look, this also plays a very big role in what we're about to talk about. If you look, 4 to TI6, 4 to Frankfurt, and you go on down the list, every Valve event in this cycle since the majors began, including TI5, all right, has had at least 3 teams, with the exception of TI6 that only had 2, but there were only 6 total, all right? When you add it all up, 22 out of the 50 invites we're talking about, 44%, were to Chinese teams. What does that mean? It is a mortal certainty that there will be 2 Chinese direct invites to TI7, and it's actually highly likely that there will be 3. Now, the third is really tricky because lately, as we'll talk about, all the Chinese teams have been beating each other. But take that for what it's worth. Very likely you're going to see 3 Chinese teams, or at least 2, and probably 3 Chinese teams in those direct invites. Now, 4 LAN events remain. Let's talk about each of the 4. All right. Before we do that, just to put this to bed, okay? Liquid, they're in. It's over. All right. They won Star Ladder I-League. A lot of people questioning, again, at the time, with Manila and Epicenter left to play, could you really say confidently that they're in? The answer is yes. They're absolutely in, and I made that statement after Star Ladder, and I will stand by that. They are currently, for example, the #1 ranked team in both ELO and Glyco 2 on DatDota. That to me is especially significant because we're very aggressive with our decay in those ratings. It's usually the case that the last big tournament winner is going to vault up to #1. It says something that even after the Manila results are included, Liquid is still the #1 ranked team. Those wins over IG and TNC, those really do help them. TNC, a lot of people viewed as a dark horse going into that event, having added 1437 as captain at the last minute. But remember, these are 3 core position players that all finished top 8 at the International 2016. This is not a no-name team. 4 out of 5 players finally on the Liquid roster have appeared in multiple major grand finals. Valve does consider pedigree. I believe Liquid are for sure in. Newbee is the team that I think can help themselves, but is not a mortal lock yet. They're runners up to EG, which again, think about Navi last year. All right. The difference is that this year, because there were only 2 majors, there's a lot more time and a lot more events in between the Kiev Major and direct invites for TI7 being announced. So Newbee, I do not think are in yet. They need to quote unquote hold serve at Zotac and or Galaxy to feel completely confident. I think if they manage to reach at least the grand finals and ideally win one of those 2 events, they're going to be in. And they're in kind of this weird situation where I actually think if not enough other teams step up in a big event, they could actually be in anyway, even if they flop at those 2 events just based on their Manila Grand Finals appearance. But they are, I think, definitely in the driver's seat in terms of being the 6th directly invited team, but they're not completely secure yet. I do feel like there are at least 2 to 3 direct invite spots yet to be determined. All right, the Zotac Cup. This is really a play-in event in my mind for either of Newbee or NP. We haven't mentioned NP yet. Remember, NP actually finished 3rd at that Manila tournament. That was some very high-quality Dota. A lot of people starting to look at them as a team that could be in the direct invite conversation. I think a win here really validates them in the same way that a win for Newbee would validate them. This is the one event, if you look at the remaining teams here, IG Vitality was, I believe, a last-minute replacement for IG that didn't necessarily want to have to compete in the grand finals at this event and then hop on a plane and play in Moscow 24 hours later. IG Vitality, with that inclusion in the field, it erodes the strength of the field even further. And the fact that I think Paparazzi, their mid player for IGV, who's currently the top MMR player in the world, actually has had some visa issues and has had to himself bow out. So they're going to be playing with a stand-in for their mid player. This is the one event that I think if a team other than NP or Newbee wins, that they're still holding their breath a little bit. All right. All of the other events, I think if a team that wasn't already in wins, I think they're in. This tournament, I think a little bit different just because of the strength of the field and the fact that the format is a little bit unusual. But take that for what it's worth. All right. Epicenter. This is, again, a good example of a tournament that if you base things solely on pedigree, this should be it. Okay. We should say this is the best tournament field this season. All right. This field is better than some majors that we've had. But the problem is, if you look at current betting odds on EGB.com, one of those 5 teams on the first row is about 80% likely to win, and all 5 of those teams are already in the TI7 field. So I actually think that Epicenter, despite being an amazing tournament field, is likely not going to have that big an impact. All right. Now, there is a possibility that a team like Thunderbirds or Secret could really help their case simply by reaching the grand finals. But that becomes a little bit more debatable. With so many tournaments to choose from, I don't think it's at all a lock that a grand finals appearance at Epicenter trumps a win at one of these other events. So Thunderbirds and Secret, I think the two teams that have an opportunity to really raise their stock. A lot of people are going to look at this and wonder I'm not talking more about Clutch Gamers. Clutch Gamers is a team that I really like. They're an incredibly exciting team to watch. But again, play styles do matter. And when you talk about Clutch Gamers, they actually had the highest average match duration going back in the previous couple patches. They're a team that's been a little unusual for SEA teams. They're a team that's been drawing games out, winning these late game team fights. This, I believe, is going to be 7.06 is a patch that's going to be all about the mid game. There are going to be some matches that go long, but if you're going into every game playing for the late game, I don't think that that's a winning strategy in the current environment. So I'm a little bearish right now on Clutch Gamers. Certainly, they can help themselves by performing well at Epicenter, but I'm not so confident that they're going to be able to do that. I hope I'm wrong about that, for the record. All right, Galaxy Battles. Again, based purely on pedigree, shouldn't matter as much as Epicenter. But when you look at the teams involved and where they stand, I actually think this event is going to matter a lot. And the reason is there are at least two teams, Newbee and TNC, if not also Thunderbirds and LGD, the last of those based purely on pedigree and brand strength. Those are four teams that really, I think Valve is sort of looking for an excuse. All right, Newbee for reasons that we've talked about before. TNC, if they win this event, they'll have a win here as well as a grand finals appearance at Star Ladder. All right. Thunderbirds and LGD. Again, Thunderbirds, if you look at that 4/5 of a roster that were runners up at TI last year, and you look at LGD as just a huge brand presence in the Chinese scene, I think any one of those four with a win in this tournament, they're probably in the field. And it's weird because there's no way that this should be a quote unquote bigger event than Epicenter, but it really is about the timing and the teams more so than any kind of statistical strength of field measure. So I actually think this is going to be a pretty big tournament, and in particular, LGD or IG Vitality, assuming they get Paparazzi back, they have the chance to play themselves firmly into the direct invite picture by doing well in this event. The Summit, again, I think this is sort of provided VP are already in, and there's a possibility, depending on what happens at Epicenter and or Zotac, that one of NP or Secret could have already played themselves into the field. In particular, I think Secret, if they make the grand finals of Epicenter, is probably in. NP with a win at Zotac would be in as well. If you look, though, that leaves 5 more teams, including it's not a certainty that either of these two teams would be a lock. So the Summit, I think, is more than likely going to determine the final invite, be it either the team that wins or possibly a team that reaches the grand final and plays VP tough. I think the Summit will also decide one of the invites. Where does that leave us? If I had to guess today, I'd say the top 4 from Kiev, Liquid is in. I do think Newbee is going to do enough, given the multiple events that they have left that are very winnable for them. I think they're going to do enough to get them there. All right. I see there being most likely 8 is the number that I'm looking at, with 8 direct invites, 6 directly qualifying teams, and then 2 more spots determined by wildcards. I think one of the final slots will be one of Secret, NP, or Thunderbirds. I think one of those teams, either NP by winning Zotac, Secret by reaching the grand finals at Epicenter or the Summit, Thunderbirds by winning in Galaxy Battles or doing well at Epicenter themselves. At least one of those teams, I think, is going to distinguish themselves enough. NP has probably the inside track now of the 3 of them, but needs a little bit more. And then I think the last spot, if TNC can outright win Galaxy Battles, I think they will be in. Otherwise, I do think Valve is really looking for an excuse to invite that third Chinese team. The problem is, again, there has to be a team that steps forward and distinguishes itself. This is also partly why I think Newbee's position is a little bit more secure than maybe a lot of people believe, because I don't see there being any way that there's going to be any less than 2 Chinese teams, and I think there's highly likely going to be a third. All right, that's where I think we stand today. I'll have a video for you hopefully in the next couple of days with an overview of the 7.06 Pro meta so far and the tournaments that we've already seen at StarLadder and Manila, what we've learned going forward that I think will affect the picture going on. But for now, this is Nahaz. Thank you guys so much for listening.